She conducts science research at the Midwood High School in Brooklyn. She facilitates the Urban Barcode Project, which is a genetics competition for high school students. Put your hands together for Stacy Goldstein.
A few days ago, some students in my class were arguing with each other during class time. Sounds kind of bad, actually. But actually, they were arguing about electron configuration. That sounds pretty terrific, doesn't it? This was different than the days where students learned chemistry from a chalkboard. Students were actually engaged in what they were learning and had a stake in their education. But how did this come about? When I started my career, the words that were thrown about were group work and inquiry and differentiation. But I always wondered to myself, what do these words actually mean? And more importantly, I wondered, what do they actually look like in a classroom? I couldn't really envision what this looked like in a classroom. I wondered, were these words just edu-speak? You know those words that sound really nice, but in practical, everyday classroom is not, you can't always see how it's actually going to come about. My name is Stacy Goldstein, and I teach chemistry. And I teach chemistry through active learning. But I didn't always do it this way, and I want to share a little bit with you tonight about my journey through active learning. When I was in high school, I learned chemistry from a chalkboard, if you remember what that was, and I was impressed, maybe it was just me, I was impressed by those teachers who could cover the whole entire board in the shortest amount of time. Okay, it wasn't just me, maybe. Maybe I need more hobbies, I don't know. But I started to learn over time that not all students would be as excited about science from the same type of instruction. I learned that maybe these words, group work and inquiry and differentiation, maybe there was something to them. I learned that they were actually essential in the classroom to reach all the students sitting in front of me. So how does this actually look like? That was my question from the beginning. What does this actually look like in the classroom? How do you conduct a class like this every day? So in my classroom, before we get bogged down in vocabulary and rules and the other nitty-gritty things that we have in chemistry that sometimes turn students off to chemistry, instead what we look at are models and analogies that get students thinking about where we're going to go before we actually go there. So instead of just talking about it, let's look at an example from an activity I did a few weeks ago. I did an activity on electron configuration. Students come into this activity knowing virtually nothing about electron configuration. Students have this model to serve in order to understand a boarding house, which is not part of chemistry, but they understand this boarding house and how boarders fill up a boarding house, which they're later going to have an analogy for how electrons fill up orbitals. So if you can join in, and if I could put you in my student's shoes for a second, if we could just look at this question together, and I'm going to read it out loud, and then we could just call out the answer. We don't do that in my class, but we'll do that here. The next floor of rooms will be open for boarders only when half of the bunks on the floor below are occupied, at least one of the rooms on the floor below are occupied, or all of the bunks on the floor below are occupied. Does anyone have an answer? All of them. Okay, good. So this concept here shows that in the boarding house, boarders have to fill the lower floors first before proceeding to higher floors. Students are going to later learn this term to be the Aufbau principle, where electrons are going to fill lower energy levels before they proceed to higher energy levels. But they don't know that yet. This is showing a concept in action. Students are getting a feel for what it is before they later in the activity apply that knowledge. They're seeing the vocabulary in action. Later in the activity, they take what they know of boarders filling up a boarding house to now understand and apply these rules to how electrons fill up orbitals and energy levels. There's a seamless transition for students working together in small groups. They can apply the rules that they understood here and they invented here to apply to understand all the rules of how the electrons will fill up orbitals. And for those of you who teach chemistry, this model over here also fills up, gives them information about Hund's rule and the Pauli exclusion principle. So it goes into a lot of detail, but it starts with students working in small groups and inventing concepts that they will use later. So what's also really exciting to me is as students work together in these small groups, and I walk around and I talk to the small groups about what they're learning, I actually hear students arguing with each other about the organization of s-PDF orbitals. They are literally arguing about it. And for me, I think to myself, what more can we actually want as an educator than for students to become so proficient in content that they can actually argue with each other using vocabulary and the concepts of that unit? That's what really resonates with me in this method. So what else resonates with me? I told you from the beginning they are inventing concepts. They are inventing vocabulary and applying it. And before they have a formal name for this vocabulary, they have a visceral feeling of what these concepts mean. And I told you also in the beginning of my career, I was kind of skeptical of this inquiry thing. I wasn't sure how it would fit in. But I think that active learning and this group work process actually allows us to balance teaching to the test, which inevitably, on some level, we have to do in our class. It allows us to balance it with teaching for understanding, which is really our most important goal in the classroom, to be able to teach for understanding. So where did these concepts come from? These concepts, some of you might have heard of this before. I've taken a lot of workshops on active learning and something called POGIL. Just briefly, POGIL stands for Process-Oriented Guided Inquiry Learning. And I think the two most important words here are guided. As a teacher, you are guide and facilitator for students' learning. And inquiry, just a very methodical cycle of inquiry that students go through to invent knowledge together. So I thought here, when I was making this, sometimes as teachers we get so excited, I have this great idea, but we don't always reflect on what do students think? Like, did they really think this was great? So I emailed some of my former students that I had, and one of the messages that came through was a student I had 2 years ago who struggled in chemistry, but she wrote me back a really thoughtful response, and I wanted to share it with you tonight. She said, what made it effective was the fact that we were able to work as a collective unit to achieve the same goal. When working in groups, it felt that I had the support from my peers. It is hard for one teacher to individually serve a group of 34 students, but when working in groups, students not only can get feedback from their fellow peers, they can also build relationships. And I think that this method also speaks to some of the other intangible skills that students learn that are not always as evident in direct instruction, which is communication skills and teamwork, which is also evident from Larissa's quote here. And so the last thing I wanted to say about this was that I hope in the last few minutes I was able to express to you my excitement for active learning and POGIL and group work. And I hope that maybe you too will consider having your students argue in class, not argue too much, but argue productively about math and science concepts, or in my case, argue about SPDF orbitals. Thank you.